In Germany, in 1923, it was cheaper to burn money than to buy firewood with it. People fed bricks of banknotes into their stoves because the cash was worth less than the wood it could have bought. Children built toy houses out of bundled, worthless bills. A single loaf of bread, which had cost about 1 mark before the war, now cost 200 billion. This is what it looks like when money dies. Not a stock market crash, not a recession. Something stranger and more total, the moment when the notes in your wallet quietly stop meaning anything at all. It has happened again and again on 4 continents within living memory. And here is the part that should unsettle you. It almost never happens by accident. Every single time, someone chooses it. This is the story of how money dies, and how, in the end, it always comes down to one fragile thing. Chapter 1. What money actually is. To understand how money dies, you first have to understand what it is, because it is far stranger than it looks. Pull a note out of your pocket. It is a piece of paper or a slip of plastic. It has almost no value of its own. You cannot eat it. You cannot build with it. It is worth something for one reason, and one reason only. Everyone around you agrees that it is. Money is not really a thing. It is a promise. A shared belief that this paper can be swapped for real goods tomorrow, just as it can today. Hold on to that idea, because everything that follows hangs on it. Money is trust, printed. Economists say money does 3 jobs at once. It is a way to pay for things, what they call a medium of exchange. It is a way to measure value, a unit of account, the ruler we use to price everything else. And it is a way to store what you have earned, to carry your work forward in time, a store of value. A healthy currency does all 3 so smoothly, you never even think about it. Hyperinflation is the disease that destroys all 3 at the same time. When money dies, you cannot safely save in it, you cannot reliably price in it, and eventually you cannot even pay with it. The ruler itself starts to melt in your hand. Now, a little inflation is completely normal. It is even healthy. Most central banks deliberately aim for around 2% a year, a gentle, predictable rise that keeps an economy moving. At 2%, prices roughly double over a human lifetime. Slow enough that you barely feel it. Hyperinflation is a different animal entirely. The classic dividing line drawn by an economist named Philip Kagan is 50%, not 50% a year, 50% a month. At that rate, prices do not double over a lifetime. They double about every 7 weeks, and then just keep doubling. This is not fast inflation. It is a different category of event, the way a spark and a wildfire are different things. And the reason hyperinflation is so terrifying is the brutal mathematics of compounding. Imagine a cup of coffee costs you 5 units of money today, and prices rise 50% every month. After 1 year, that same 5-unit coffee costs about 600. After 2 years, more than 80,000. After 3, past 10 million for 1 cup. The numbers stop feeling real, and that is exactly the point. Once a currency is on this curve, it is not slowly losing value. It is racing towards zero. The only question left is how fast. There is a famous line written by the economist John Maynard Keynes back in 1909. He wrote, "Lenin is said to have declared that the best way to destroy the capitalist system was to debauch the currency. To debauch means to corrupt, to ruin, to spoil completely." And whether or not Lenin ever really said it, Keynes understood why it would work. Wreck a nation's money, and you do not just raise its prices. You dissolve the invisible trust that lets strangers cooperate, that lets people save, plan, and believe in tomorrow. Destroy the currency, and you destroy the glue of an entire society. So how do you actually destroy it? Almost always with a printing press. Chapter 2. How money dies. Nearly every hyperinflation in history runs the same engine, and it works like a loop that feeds itself. It begins when a government has to spend far more than it can possibly raise. Step 1. A hole opens in the budget. A war, a collapse, a debt that cannot be paid. Step 2. The government cannot fill that hole. It cannot tax enough, and no one will lend to it. So Step 3. It does the one thing a government can always do. It prints the money it does not have. For a brief moment, this works. But more money chasing the same goods means Step 4. Prices rise. And here is the trap. Higher prices mean the freshly printed money now buys less, so the hole in the budget yawns right back open. So the government prints again and again. The loop tightens with every single turn. But why would any government do this to its own people? Because printing money is a tax, a hidden one that nobody has to vote for. Economists call it seigniorage, but you can just call it the inflation tax. When a government prints new money and spends it, it is quietly draining value out of every note already sitting in your wallet, transferring your savings to itself without ever passing a law. For a desperate regime, losing a war, facing a revolution, its tax system in ruins, it is almost irresistible. It is the only tax you can still collect when nobody will pay their taxes and nobody will lend you a cent. That is why hyperinflation almost always rides in on the back of catastrophe. The printing press alone, though, does not explain the truly vertical numbers. The real accelerant is something economists call velocity. It simply means how fast money changes hands. In calm times, you might hold your paycheck for weeks, spending it slowly. But when prices are doubling every few days, holding cash is like clutching an ice cube in your fist. So everyone tries to spend their money the instant they receive it, before it melts away. Workers get paid twice a day and sprint to the shops at lunch. And here is the cruel twist. All of that frantic spending, money flying through the economy faster and faster, drives prices up faster still. The harder people run from the currency, the quicker it dies, which exposes the cruelest trap of all. Once the spiral begins, the government cannot simply stop because it now needs to print even more money just to stand still. Each new wave of notes is worth less than the last, so it takes an ever bigger flood just to pay the same soldiers and the same bills. The presses have to run faster and faster simply to keep the government from going broke today, even though everyone knows it guarantees disaster tomorrow. It is like drinking seawater to quench a thirst. Every desperate gulp only makes the next one more desperate. And this is the moment that turns ordinary inflation into hyperinflation. The moment people lose their faith. As long as you trust that your money will hold its value, you are happy to keep it. But the instant you expect it to be worthless tomorrow, you dump it today. And so does everyone else. That collective loss of faith is self-fulfilling. The mere expectation of collapse causes the collapse, which means hyperinflation is not really an economic event at all. It is a psychological one. It is what a bank run looks like when the thing everyone is running away from is money itself. Chapter 3. Germany, 1923. To watch the whole script play out, start with the most famous case of all, Weimar Germany. And it begins, as so many of these stories do, with a war. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Germany made a fateful decision about how to pay for it. Rather than raise taxes on its people, it borrowed enormous sums, and it printed, gambling everything on victory. The plan was simple and ruthless: win the war, then force the defeated enemies to pay the entire bill. By 1918, that gamble had failed completely. Germany did not win. It lost. And it emerged from the war buried under a mountain of debt with a currency it had already quietly begun to inflate. Then came the bill. The 1919 Treaty of Versailles laid the war's guilt squarely at Germany's feet, and in 1921, the Allies presented the invoice, reparations of 132 billion gold marks. Notice that word, gold. This was not the paper currency Germany could simply print. It was a sum demanded in hard, gold-backed value that Germany simply did not have. A broke, defeated nation had just been handed a debt it could not possibly pay, in a kind of money it could not manufacture. The pressure on the mark was now unbearable. All it needed was a trigger. The trigger came in January 1923. Germany fell behind on its reparations payments, and France's answer was to send in troops, occupying the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, the smoking valley of coal and steel that powered the entire economy. The German government called for passive resistance. It told the workers of the Ruhr to down tools, to strike rather than produce a single ton of coal for the occupiers. It was a bold act of defiance. But it meant that millions of striking workers still had to be paid, while the very factories that funded the country fell silent. So how do you pay a whole region to stop working? The government reached, once again, for the printing press. And this time, it never let go. What happened next is almost impossible to picture. Before the war, the German mark had traded at about 4 to the US dollar. By the start of 1923, it took roughly 7,000 marks to buy a single dollar. By that summer, 1 million. And by November 1923, the peak of the madness, 1 US dollar was worth about 4.2 trillion marks. Trillion. The currency had not just weakened, it had fallen off a cliff so steep the numbers lose all meaning. At the very worst, prices in the shops were doubling roughly every couple of days. And so Germany slipped into a kind of waking nightmare. Workers were paid twice, sometimes 3 times a day, handed their wages in bundles the size of bricks. They would rush to spend it all on their lunch break because by the evening it would buy half as much. People carried cash in wheelbarrows, in laundry baskets, in suitcases, and in a detail that tells you everything, the thieves would steal the basket and tip the money out onto the street. A wheelbarrow of banknotes, left for a moment unattended, would be found dumped on the pavement, the worthless paper abandoned, the wheelbarrow gone. The scale of the printing is hard to comprehend. By late 1923, the German central bank had over 30 paper mills and more than 130 printing firms running around the clock just to keep the country supplied with banknotes. Towns, companies, even restaurants began printing their own emergency money called Notgeld, simply because the official presses could not keep up. They printed notes denominated in the billions, then the hundreds of billions, then the trillions. An entire nation's industrial might redirected to the single task of manufacturing paper that was worthless almost before the ink had dried. Now here is the part most people miss. A dying currency does not hurt everyone equally. It is not a flood that drowns the whole country at once. It is a brutal, silent transfer of wealth from one group to another. On the losing side, anyone who had saved. A lifetime of careful savings, a pension, a bond, an insurance policy, all of it counted in marks, all of it melting to nothing. The prudent, thrifty middle class was simply wiped out. On the winning side, anyone who owed money. If you held a mortgage or a business loan, your debt evaporated. You could repay a fortune with what was now loose change. Hyperinflation punishes the saver and rewards the borrower. It turns the entire moral order of money upside down. So how did it end? Almost overnight. And the way it ended is the key to this whole story. In November 1923, Germany introduced a brand new currency, the Rentenmark. On paper, it was supposedly backed by the nation's land and industry, but the real magic was not the backing. It was the promise, credible this time, that the printing would finally stop. A new and independent body was created to issue the money and strictly limited how much could ever exist. And the instant people believed that promise, the panic simply stopped. The new money held its value. Confidence came flooding back within days. They called it the miracle of the Rentenmark. But it was no miracle. It was proof of something profound. The cure for a dead currency is not gold or wealth or force. It is belief. But the damage was already done, and not only to bank accounts. Something deeper had been broken. Millions of Germans had watched their savings, their security, and their faith in their own government dissolve into worthless paper. The careful had been punished. The system itself had betrayed them, That kind of trauma does not vanish when the prices finally settle. It curdles into resentment and a hunger for someone to blame. Historians still argue over the precise connections, but few doubt that the wreckage of 1923, the shattered middle class, the contempt for a government that had failed so completely, helped poison the soil in which extremism would later take root. When money dies, it can drag a great deal more than savings down with it. Chapter 4. The worst that ever happened. If Weimar Germany is the most famous hyperinflation, it is not the worst. Not even close. That grim record belongs to Hungary in 1946 in the shattered aftermath of the Second World War. And the numbers are so extreme, they read like a misprint. In Germany, at the peak, prices doubled every couple of days. In Hungary, at the peak in July 1946, prices doubled every 15 hours. Read that again. Not 15 days. 15 hours. A price you saw in the morning was meaningless by the time you went to bed. The monthly inflation rate reached a number with 16 zeros after it. To this day, it remains the fastest a currency has ever died anywhere on Earth. Hungary's currency was the pengo, and to keep pace with the insanity, the government printed ever more ludicrous denominations. They ran clean out of ordinary words for the numbers. First came the milpengo, 1 million pengo, then the bipengo, 1 trillion pengo. The largest banknote ever actually issued in human history dates from this moment, 100 quintillion pengo. That is a 1, followed by 20 zeros, printed on a single note, and it was barely worth anything at all. They even prepared a note for a sextillion, a 1 with 21 zeros, that became worthless before it could be released. The presses, quite literally, could not print zeros fast enough to keep up with the death of the money. And how did Hungary escape the worst hyperinflation in the history of the world, in exactly the same way Germany had? On the 1st of August 1946, the government scrapped the pengo entirely and introduced a fresh currency, the forint, anchored and strictly limited. To swap the old money for the new, the rate was almost beyond belief. One single forint was worth a 4, followed by 29 zeros in old pengo. The flood of paper stopped. Trust was rebuilt from zero. And the fastest dying money the world has ever seen was simply replaced, and the bleeding stopped at once. The same cure, yet again, stop the printing, restore the belief. Chapter 5. Zimbabwe. For most of the 20th century, hyperinflation felt like a ghost of the past, a horror sealed away in old black and white photographs of Germans with their wheelbarrows. Then, at the dawn of the 21st century, it came roaring back in a country that had once been called the breadbasket of Africa, Zimbabwe. The story begins around the year 2000, when the government of Robert Mugabe launched a chaotic seizure of the country's commercial farms. Whatever the politics of it, the economic result was catastrophic. Agricultural output collapsed. A nation that had fed itself and exported food to its neighbors suddenly could do neither. The economy caved in, and with it, the government's ability to collect taxes. And a government with no income but plenty of bills, including the cost of a foreign war, does what desperate governments always do. It printed. By the mid-2000s, Zimbabwe's inflation had left the normal world behind and turned vertical. In 2007, prices were more than doubling every few weeks. By 2008, they were doubling roughly every day. At the very peak, in November 2008, economists later estimated the monthly inflation rate at around 79 billion%. Let me make that concrete. A price would double, on average, in a little under 24 hours. You could buy a coffee in the morning, and the very same coffee would cost you twice as much the next morning, every day, relentlessly, for months on end. And so Zimbabwe minted the most infamous banknote of the modern age, a note that is now a museum piece and a grim internet legend. To keep up with the collapse, the Reserve Bank printed bills with more and more zeros until, in early 2009, it issued this, the 100 trillion Zimbabwe dollar note. A single piece of paper carrying a 1 followed by 14 zeros. And at the moment it was released, that $100 trillion note was worth, at most, only a few US dollars. Not even enough, much of the time, to buy a loaf of bread or a bus ticket home. The largest number ever printed on a circulating banknote could barely buy you lunch. Daily life became surreal. Shops repriced their goods 2 or 3 times a day, sending staff around the aisles with sticker guns. People rushed to spend their wages within hours of being paid. Bartering came creeping back as people traded for bread with anything except the national currency. The government kept slicing zeros off the money to make it manageable. Across the whole crisis, it lopped a grand total of 25 zeros off the Zimbabwe dollar in a series of revaluations, and it still could not outrun the collapse. The money was, quite simply, dying faster than the state could redesign it. So in 2009, Zimbabwe did something extraordinary, the ultimate confession of defeat. It gave up. It abandoned its own currency entirely. The Zimbabwe dollar was switched off, and the country began using foreign money instead, mainly the US dollar and the South African rand. And the instant Zimbabweans could earn and save in a currency their government could not print, the hyperinflation stopped dead. It is the same lesson, in its most extreme form, when a people lose all faith in their money. Sometimes the only way to restore trust is to borrow somebody else's. A nation's deepest symbol of sovereignty, its very own money, thrown away just to buy back stability. If you are still with me, you have probably started to notice the pattern repeating itself. And we are about to watch it tear through a wealthy, oil-rich nation in our own decade. Before we do, if this is making the chaos finally click into place, take a second and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel grow more than you would think. Okay, from a $100 trillion note to a country sitting on the largest oil reserves on the planet. Chapter 6, Venezuela. Here is a fact that should be impossible. Venezuela holds the largest proven oil reserves on the entire planet. More crude oil sits beneath its soil than under Saudi Arabia, than Russia, than the United States. By rights, it should be one of the richest nations on earth. And yet, over the past decade, Venezuela suffered one of the worst hyperinflations in modern history. Its people went hungry. Its money turned to garbage. Millions fled across the borders on foot. So how do you go bankrupt while sitting on an ocean of oil? The answer is a masterclass in how money really dies. And it proves that no amount of natural wealth can save a currency once the trust is gone. Venezuela had built almost its entire economy on a single bet: oil. When oil prices were high, the government spent lavishly, funding popular social programs and importing nearly everything the country used. But it spent more than even high oil revenues could cover, plugging the gap by borrowing, and increasingly, by printing. Then, around 2014, the price of oil crashed. Overnight, the government's main source of income collapsed, but its spending and its debts did not. The hole in the budget was vast, and to fill it, the central bank, by now stripped of its independence, did the only thing it was permitted to do. It ran the presses. By now, you know this story by heart, and the government made the collapse worse with a classic mistake. As prices soared, it tried to outlaw the problem, ordering shops to sell goods at fixed, low prices. But if it costs a baker more to make the bread than the law allows him to charge for it, he simply stops making bread. So the shelves emptied. Shortages of food, medicine, and basic goods swept the country. Long queues formed outside half-stocked shops. Price controls did not stop the inflation. They just added scarcity on top of it. Punishing the shopkeeper, it turns out, does nothing to fix a currency the government is busy destroying. The result was numbers that put even Zimbabwe in the conversation. Inflation tore past 100%, then 1,000%, then higher still. By 2018, the International Monetary Fund estimated that Venezuela's annual inflation rate was heading toward 1,000,000%. 1 million. Prices were, at times, doubling within weeks. The bolivar, the national currency, was dying so fast that cash became almost a joke. People stopped counting their banknotes and started weighing them on scales because counting took too long and the bills were worth so little it simply was not worth the effort. To cope, Venezuela did what Germany, Hungary, and Zimbabwe had all done before it. It started deleting zeros. In 2008, it knocked 3 zeros off the currency. In 2018, it stripped away 5 more. In 2021, it erased another 6. Add it all up, and across these reforms, Venezuela lopped 14 zeros off its money in the space of about 13 years. A bank balance of 100 trillion old bolivars became a single new one. They were, quite literally, redrawing their currency faster than most countries redesign their flags. And it still was not enough. But behind the dizzying numbers were real human beings, and the cost to them was staggering. As the money died, so did the ability to buy food and medicine. Hospitals ran short of basic supplies. Families skipped meals. And so people did the only thing left to do. They left. More than 7 million Venezuelans, roughly a quarter of the entire population, fled the country in one of the largest displacement crises anywhere on the planet, rivaling the refugee flows of a major war. This is what the abstract numbers actually mean. A hyperinflation is not a chart. It is millions of people walking out of their own homeland because the money in their pockets has turned to dust. And how did Venezuela claw its way back towards some kind of stability? By now, you already know the answer. Quietly, unofficially, the country dollarized. People simply stopped using the dying bolivar for anything that mattered and switched to US dollars instead, in cash, passed hand to hand, for rent, for groceries, for wages. The government, which had once banned the practice, eventually had to look the other way. Once again, the only way to stop the bleeding was to reach for a money the government could not print. The very same cure, on 4 continents, across 100 years, take away the broken promise and replace it with one that people can actually believe. Chapter 7. The script they all follow. Now step back and look at what we have just seen. Germany, Hungary, Zimbabwe, Venezuela. Separated by whole continents and a century of history. These are not 4 unrelated disasters. They are the same disaster 4 times over, following an almost identical script. Step 1. A catastrophe blows a massive hole in the government's budget. A lost war, a revolution, a collapse in production. Step 2. The government can neither tax nor borrow enough to fill it. Step 3. A central bank that answers to politicians rather than to the public prints money to cover the gap. Step 4. The people work out what is happening, lose their faith, and start dumping the currency. Velocity explodes. Step 5. The spiral goes vertical, and the money dies. Every time. The very same 5 steps. And these are only the most dramatic cases. Hyperinflation is not some rare, exotic event. By one careful count, it is struck more than 50 times in the last century alone. Revolutionary France, as it printed paper money called assignats into oblivion. Greece, under wartime occupation. Yugoslavia, in the 1990s, as the country violently tore itself apart, where prices at the peak doubled every 34 hours and the state issued a 500 billion dinar note. Across the former Soviet world, again and again throughout Latin America, wherever a state has fractured, lost a war, or simply lost control of its own finances, the same fever has appeared. It is one of history's most reliable symptoms of a society under unbearable strain. But here is the single most important thing to understand about all of it. The idea that ties this entire story together. We tend to say that hyperinflation is caused by printing too much money. That is true, but it is not the heart of it. Plenty of countries print plenty of money without their currency ever dying. The real cause, the thing that turns ordinary inflation into a vertical collapse, is the death of trust. A currency is a promise. And hyperinflation is the moment the public stops believing that promise will ever be kept. The printing is just the match. The collapse of confidence is the gasoline. Grasp that one distinction, and the whole bewildering phenomenon suddenly makes sense. And nothing proves it better than the cure. Look back at how every one of these nightmares actually ended. Germany, Hungary, Zimbabwe, Venezuela. In each case, the cure was the same, and it was almost instant. Not years of slow, painful healing. Days, sometimes. You create a new currency, or you adopt a foreign one. You make a hard, credible promise to stop the printing, usually by handing control to someone who cannot be bullied into running the presses. And the moment people believe that promise, the spiral simply stops. The prices freeze. The panic drains away. If hyperinflation were really just about the sheer quantity of paper, the cure could not possibly work that fast. It works that fast because the disease was never truly about the paper. It was about belief. So if the cure is known and fast and has worked every single time, why does hyperinflation keep happening? Why did Venezuela's leaders not simply read the Zimbabwe playbook? Because the cure is politically agonizing. Stopping the printing means stopping the spending. Austerity, broken promises, admitting failure. Handing your central bank its independence means surrendering your most convenient source of cash. For a regime fighting just to survive, the printing press is always the path of least resistance, right up until the catastrophe arrives. The knowledge is never the problem. The will is, which raises the question that matters most to you. Could it happen here, to a wealthy, stable, modern economy? Chapter 8. Could it happen to you? It is a fair question, especially after the last few years, when governments everywhere printed money on a colossal scale and inflation jumped to levels not seen in decades. So why did the United States, Britain, Japan, or the Eurozone not spiral into hyperinflation? The answer comes down to the very things our four victims had lost. First, independent central banks. The Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank. These institutions can, and do, say no to the politicians, raising interest rates to crush inflation even when it is wildly unpopular. Second, they borrow in their own currency over long stretches of time from people who still trust them. As long as the world will lend to you at 3% for 30 years, you never have to reach for the printing press in a panic. Trust buys you options. Losing it takes them all away. But wait, you might say, didn't these countries print trillions after 2008 and again during the pandemic? You may have heard the term quantitative easing and wondered if it was the same dangerous thing. It is not. And the difference is everything. When a central bank does quantitative easing, it does create new money to buy government bonds. But it does so as a temporary, reversible swap, fully intending to undo it later, and crucially, in order to hit a low, stable inflation target. Hyperinflation is something else entirely. A central bank printing money to pay the government's everyday bills, directly, permanently, with no plan and no power to ever stop. One is a controlled tool, used by a trusted institution. The other is a desperate act by a cornered one. They can look alike on a chart. In practice, they could not be more different. And that difference is exactly why the great inflation scare of recent years was painful, but never fatal. When prices surged after the pandemic, inflation in the United States and Europe peaked at around 9%. 9% is genuinely bad. The worst in 40 years, a real squeeze on every household. But hold it up against our story for just a second. 9% a year against 50% a month, which is merely the starting line for hyperinflation. It is the difference between a fever and a fatal disease. And what did the trusted central banks do? They raised interest rates hard and fast, deliberately slowing their own economies to protect the one thing that truly matters, the public's belief that they would never let the money die. They were defending the trust. Still, no currency is truly invincible, and history leaves us a checklist of warning signs. The smoke that comes before the fire. Watch for them. When a government can no longer borrow and starts leaning on its central bank to fund it directly. When that central bank loses its independence and bends to whoever holds power. When a country's debts are short-term and owed in someone else's currency, so it cannot quietly inflate them away. And the final telltale signal when ordinary people stop trusting their own money. When they begin pricing things in dollars, hoarding hard assets, or quietly moving their savings abroad. That silent flight from the currency is very often the last warning just before the dam breaks. Hyperinflation does not arrive out of a clear blue sky. It announces itself if you know what to look for. And that is the modern escape hatch, the place people run to now when their own money begins to fail. For most of history, the desperate fled into gold or into whatever stable foreign cash they could smuggle. Today, they flee into the US dollar above all, but also, increasingly, into things their own government cannot touch, foreign bank accounts, and digital currencies like Bitcoin. In countries with shaky money, you now see ordinary people storing their savings in a phone app, not because they are speculators, but because they have learned, the hard way, the oldest lesson in this entire story. Never hold all your wealth in a promise that the people in charge can break at will. And so the printing of money has always been, at its core, a quiet kind of theft. The economist Milton Friedman put it about as sharply as anyone ever has. Inflation, he said, is the one form of taxation that can be imposed without legislation, no vote, no law, no debate. Just a silent transfer from everyone who holds the currency to the government that prints it. In ordinary times, that theft is small, almost invisible. In a hyperinflation, it becomes total, the complete confiscation of a nation's savings, carried out in plain sight, one banknote at a time. Which brings us right back to where we began, and to the strange, fragile truth at the center of all of this. Every currency on earth, the dollar in your wallet, the numbers glowing in your bank account, is held up by nothing more solid than a shared act of faith. We agree that the paper has value, and so it does. Hyperinflation is simply what it looks like when that agreement shatters. The instant a society stops believing and the spell breaks. The money itself does not physically change. It is the same paper it always was. What dies is the belief. And that is the lesson written into every wheelbarrow of worthless marks and every $100 trillion note. The money was never the thing of value. The trust was. Chapter 9. A story we tell. So, what happens when money dies? A loaf of bread costs $200 billion. A lifetime of savings turns to confetti. People weigh their cash instead of counting it and walk out of their own countries just to survive. But underneath the dizzying numbers, the real story is always the same, and it is almost unbearably human. A promise was broken, and a people stopped believing. Money is the most powerful shared story we have ever told. And like any story, it lasts only as long as we all keep telling it together. The notes in your pocket are not really wealth. They are a claim on the trust of millions of strangers you will never meet, a trust built up over decades and capable of vanishing in a season. Most of the time, that trust holds, and the machine hums along so smoothly we forget it is even there. But every so often, in Berlin, in Budapest, in Harare, in Caracas, the spell breaks, and we are reminded what the paper was always really worth. Thanks for watching. The Money Lens. If this changed the way you see the money in your pocket, you know what to do, and I will see you in the next one.